So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the afternoon portion of the Economic Recovery and Employee Ownership Conference. I'm going to start this afternoon's sessions talking about governance, looking at governance in both the worker co-op model and the ESOP model, what they have in common and how they are different. And for those of you who were not with us this morning, our speaker for this session is Chris Cooper of the Ohio Employee Ownership Center. He's the director of OEOC at Kent State University. In his 20 years at the OEOC, he's done almost everything at one point or another, but now focuses primarily on ownership culture education and coordinating Ohio's employee-owned network, working with business owners on succession planning and sales to employees, and business development and employee-owned startups. Prior to joining the center, he spent over 15 years working in various capacities in small family-owned and closely held businesses in the hospitality and food service industries. He's also a substitute teacher with the Kent City Schools, worked at the SEIU Local 47 in Cleveland, and is a graduate of Kent State's Political Science program. Welcome back, Chris.
All right, great. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Good to be back. I just want to give a quick shout out to Rick, who is helping to organize this from the Indiana Center. Rick and I are going to kind of be tag teaming a little bit on this presentation. So Rick, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself real quick or.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Rick Bandol. I'm with the Indiana Center for Employee Ownership. And much as Chris, both of our organizations deal with ESOPs. Chris also deals with co-ops, but we deal with education advocacy for business owners looking at, what happens next and who should own my business after myself. My center has been active since 2017, and we look forward to a good discussion on governance because we're going to help demystify it a little bit.
Great, super. So let's go ahead and get started. Hope everyone had a good lunch and that maybe we had, after having a big meal, we had some coffee or some tea or something to keep us active right after lunch. So one of the things that Rick and I were talking about, what we wanted to do with this presentation was demystify things a little bit. And what we mean by that is I think that, corporate governance kind of has a basic skeleton or a basic model that all corporations, regardless of the type, kind of follow, right? There's of course variation, and we're going to talk about some of those variations through this presentation, but that's going to be hopefully the big key point that we all get out of this session. So again, as I just mentioned, I kind of got out in front of my first slide a little bit, but corporate governance in the U.S. generally follows a sort of pattern, even employee-owned companies, regardless of model. And so bring in Rick. So as Rick and I were talking about this presentation, he had some great stuff to add. And so this next slide, Rick, take it over.
Sure, will do. So, the board has a responsibility for duty of care, and the board is responsible to ensure that all assets are used prudently. The board has a duty of loyalty, ensuring that all decisions are made in the best interest of the organization and to help it move closer to its mission. And a duty of obedience, ensuring the organization abides by all laws and regulations, as well as its own bylaws. And regardless of, what type of industry or profession, every board of directors is responsible for the following things. They're responsible to help set strategic governance and oversight of the organization. How are they doing in meeting, management projections in terms of the budgets from a valuation perspective, in achieving the organization's goals and missions. Serving the organization stakeholders in an employee-owned company. This could be the company, this could be the shareholders, this could be the trustee, to make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing. Managing budgets, we're not necessarily going to sign off every check or every expense report that comes in, but the board's responsible from a high-level perspective for review and approval of the budgets, and then for oversight, how is the company doing in meeting those budgets? Are they spending on the right things? Are they missing marks? Are there things that the company's not doing that they should be doing in order to help achieve those management projections? And setting policies, of course. Overseeing personnel in an ESOP, this could be the trustee. It could also be the board's responsibility to monitor the performance of the CEO and president. One of the board's biggest responsibilities is, monitoring the performance of the CEO and president, hiring a new replacement, and or firing the president. Again, setting goals and then measuring goals and achievements. If we're going to be paying out bonuses based on performance, did the company really meet and achieve those goals, or are we being dilutive to the participants, whether it's a co-op or an ESOP? We can't just pay the president and CEO these big bonuses when they didn't perform. And again, that's one of the responsibilities of the board. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, great. So as Rick just outlined there, the big kind of the key component for a company is the board of directors. So if we take a look at the general kind of decision-making tree, so to speak, I guess, or flow in a typical corporation, including employee-owned companies, we have at the top, we have the owners or shareholders, right? Those are the folks that own the asset or the business, right? And so they are usually a part of and also or appoint the board of directors, which is kind of the key decision-making group, the top line decision-making group. And as Rick just laid out, then we bring in the management, right? The board of directors hires, fires, oversees, directs from a high level what the management does, and of course it's management that in some fashion hires and fires and coordinates and well manages, right? The employees on a daily basis. One of the things that makes employee-owned companies different is who makes up each of those groups. So when we so you saw in the early parts of today's program, kind of got a good outline of a lot of the technical aspects of how ESOPs and co-ops are kind of structured. So what we have is we have a different, generally a different group of people who make up those groups, right? So in a worker cooperative, we have the member owners or the worker owners are also usually highly represented on the board. With an ESOP, it could be the trustee and all of those kind of things. So that's where the real difference is between an employee-owned company and a typical entrepreneurially owned company, right? Where you have one or two single owners who tend to kind of fill a lot of those different roles at the same time, right? That we talked about. So we're going to talk a little bit about ESOPs first, and then we're going to bring in the co-op side of things. So as was mentioned in previous segments of today's program, an ESOP is a qualified retirement plan trust and not a form of corporate entity, right? So the corporate structure is going to follow the typical corporate structure of a C Corp or an S Corp, and that ESOP kind of sits on top of that, right? So generally, ESOP governance is corporate governance, right? Generally. And one of the differences, with an ESOP is that it has, as it is a trust, right? It has this thing called a trustee. All trusts must have trustees, right? And so as a trust, the ESOP has that trustee who represents the participating employees and protects their interests as participants in the ESOP, not necessarily as employees or as employee owners. So there's a whole kind of a subsection of corporate governance in ESOP companies that kind of talks about that difference. The trustee is there to protect the interests of the participants as participants, not necessarily as employees of the company. And technically, and this was talked about in the earlier sessions as well, the ESOP trustee is the shareholder of record for the shares that are in that trust or in that ESOP, right? So when we talk about the trustee can be independent or directed. They can be institutional or individual, or they can be inside or outside. The law itself is not, it doesn't necessarily tell you who can be a trustee, as long as you don't have, I think there's some things in there, like you can't have a criminal record, for example, and you have to be kind of an upstanding type person, right? So Rick, feel free to jump in here, but the difference between an independent or directed trustee. So an independent trustee is going to operate independently, just like the name says. And a directed trustee can be directed by for example, the board of directors, the ESOP administration committee, or some other entity within the business that is going to instruct the trustee what they should and should not do.
Yeah, a lot of times what will happen is that the ESOP participants are represented by the plan administration committee, and that
Right.
plan administration committee will be working with the trustee and providing, some direction in terms of what to do or how to do it, as opposed to, as you said, a person that's completely independent. And sometimes that's identified in the plan description in terms of what are the limitations or what are the requirements, such as pass-through voting, that the employee owners would have an opportunity to participate with.
Yeah, those are all great points. And one of the things to remember with a directed trustee, though, is that if the trustee gets directed to, for example, break the law or to not follow what's in your ESOP plan, then the trustee can overrule that direction if they feel that following that direction would cause them to violate the law, for example. Right. So there's, even with a directed trustee, the trustee is going to have some independence, but that directed trustee can help the company have a little bit more of I don't want to say necessarily control, but I guess maybe that's it, right? Kind of input on the decisions that the trustee makes. And we
Yeah,
talk about institutional or individual trustees. So if when we talk about the external trustees, there are companies out there that their line of work is trusteeing qualified retirement plans like ESOPs. And so we tend to refer to those folks as institutional trustee, large organizations that have multiple trustees under the same umbrella. And they kind of act as trustee for a number of different plans. Then we have what we might call individual trustees. Now that individual trustee can also be do the same work for multiple companies, but they tend to be smaller organizations, or quite frankly, it could be an individual person that the company taps or the board of directors taps to act as trustee of the plan. And the final thing is inside or outside. So again, there is no limit in the law that says, your trustee has to be someone who is outside of the company. It could actually be someone inside the company that acts as trustees. We have a number of ESOP companies in our network of companies that the trustee is a group of 3 or so people from within the company that act as a committee to trustee the plan. And then also you can have folks like the institutional or individual trustees outside the plan. So Rick, tell me, in your company, in the company that you helped set up the ESOP, where does your trustee fit along these different categories?
Yeah, so our trustee is directed. It's an institutional trustee, and it's outside. And the reasons for doing that were, there's a fiduciary responsibility for being the trustee, and oftentimes, while the CFO or a group of folks could be the inside trustee, it's sometimes really challenging to be able to serve 2 masters. So on one shoulder, you've got, hey, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the plan participants to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And on the other shoulder, wow, if I do this, I'm going to be able to really make an impact to the profitability of the company, which may negatively impact my fiduciary responsibility. So how do you really balance, that relationship between, the fiduciary responsibility and then the duty of loyalty to the company, and to be able to do the right thing? And sometimes, people do it, so it can be done, but we just didn't want to walk down that path. The same reason why we went with an outside trustee. It was easier to do that, to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the wrinkles with ESOP law is that technically it is legal for example, if you're first setting up the ESOP, you're going to need a trustee for that transaction. And it is legal for that selling business owner to also act as the trustee. And it's essentially, again, the trustee is the owner of record for that ESOP. So essentially that selling owner could operate as both the buyer and the seller of the business. Now, generally speaking, we don't see that a whole lot anymore, if at all, because clearly, right, as Rick just mentioned, right, wearing the different hats, there's a high potential for a conflict of interest to happen, right? And
Mhm.
so ESOPs, because they are qualified retirement plans, are regulated. They are regulated by the Department of Labor and the IRS. And so those are the kind of things that those oversight folks are going to be looking at. Are we kind of playing both sides of the transaction, right? And so if you're interested, if you're thinking about setting up the ESOP, know that you may hear that you can also, if you're the selling owner, also operate as the trustee or the buyer of the business. You really want to kind of think long and hard about whether you want to kind of put that kind of responsibility on yourself. As Rick mentioned, you have a fiduciary, the trustee has a fiduciary responsibility. And so what differentiates fiduciary responsibility, for example, from a general corporate responsibility, is that you do have personal liability for making fiduciary mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why, we don't necessarily recommend it. And I think that's why Rick kind of, when they were setting up their structure with their ESOP, why they went for that outside independent directed trustee.
Yeah, it's really hard to have the transaction at an arm's length transaction when it's the same person that's buying as the same person that's selling. And
Yeah,
clearly the seller has, a vested interest in getting as high as price as possible. And when you're the trustee negotiating the price, it's like, yeah, that sounds fair. Sure, I can do another million to the seller, not a problem. But that's going to come back to probably get you because of the lack of arm's length transaction in that case.
yeah. And so you gotta, I don't have any hats to fulfill the visual aid there, but if you can see my arms waving in the air. But the idea is, can you fully kind of wear those different hats and give either of those roles full justice in doing that situation? So one of the interesting things, and this was mentioned, I think in at least one of the previous sessions, it might have been in both, the ESOP trustee is an interesting thing, right? So the trustee is hired generally by the board of directors, but can also appoint and elect or even get rid of the board of directors, right? And so that's that interesting wrinkle of the law that allows that kind of relationship. Now, let's be clear that those kind of conflicts where, for example, the board wants to get rid of the trustee and the trustee decides to get rid of the board, that doesn't happen generally very, very often, if at all. It's really kind of rare. But it is a possibility there with the ESOP, with the way the ESOP governance is structured. One of the other things that we should be clear about is that the trustee does not run the company. Generally, right? If the trustee is running the company, you have a lot of problems within that company to go beyond having an ESOP or even having a trustee, right? What the trustee is there for is to protect, as I mentioned, to protect the interests of the participants as participants in the retirement plan that is an ESOP, right? And so they probably don't want to be involved in running the company, nor should they probably be involved in running the company on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things we talk a lot about in ESOP governance is the difference between a fiduciary responsibility and or fiduciary functions and what we call settler functions, right? Which is the purview of the board of directors in the company and also the management of the company. So if, again, the trustee is going to take a look at, kind of keep an eye on things, have an oversight function, right? Where they're going to, if something's happening to the company and the value of the ESOP, and hence the value of the company is something really bad is happening with the company, they may start to ask some questions. Why are these things happening, right? But it's really the board of directors and the management of the company that are running the company. One of the other things that a trustee is going to do is likely recommend outside directors. So Rick and I were talking about this before we got started here on this segment. And for a lot of small businesses, you have the entrepreneurial model of board structure, right? Where it's the business owner, maybe a spouse, maybe a friend, maybe a relative, maybe their attorney that's also on the board, right? And so one of the best practices for an ESOP company is to think about having outside directors. And I think, Rick, you had that experience with your board at your company. Can you tell us kind of the why, and also kind of maybe some of the benefits of having outside directors on the board, kind of expanding
Sure.
that group of people?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. One of the challenges in a closely held privately owned company is oftentimes, like Chris said, the people that are managing the company day to day are the same people that are on the board. So when you have a board meeting, it's like, yeah, we all know what's going on, and okay, meeting adjourned. So there's not a lot of, depending upon the trust level and the comfort level within the company, there may or may not be a lot of questioning, a lot of discussion, a lot of, pointed, hey, why are we doing this and how do we do that? Because, you're kind of all in the soup pot together, right? And one of the things in transitioning, from say a passive board, which is basically, we're just here to kind of ratify what they do, and we're not really challenging anything, we're not really doing anything, to a more engaged board, is that you've got people outside the company who aren't aware of what's happening on a daily basis, who are looking to the company to be able to provide that narrative in terms of, hey, here's the financials, here's why they went up, here's why they went down, this is what we're doing about it, as opposed to, yeah, okay, well, we know we had a bad week, we're done. And I think it's, in my opinion, it's part of that, progression from growing up as a company, where you're moving up beyond just it's the same management team that's on the board, as to where now you've got, again, external folks who are asking questions, who are helping the company, maybe evaluate what they're doing, and maybe making recommendations in terms of, hey, based on our experience, here's some other things that maybe you consider, where that council wouldn't be there in an internal board. And in our case, we had transitioned from a fully internal board to adding a board advisor, which was non-voting when we were still an LLC. So we kind of were starting down that path. And then as part of the transition to employee ownership, our trustee mandated that we add a voting outside board member, and then ideally move towards a more externally dominated board over time. So we started off by, we transitioned our founder off the board, and we transitioned our board advisor as a full voting member. We made him our comp committee lead, to be able to take a look at compensation for the top executives in the company. Again, to give it that external view perspective, that we're not just, taking money out of one pocket and putting it in another, that there's some, real evaluation and discussion associated with that. And of course, those went back to the board for full review. And then over time, we added a lawyer on our board, because we were looking at growth through M&A, and we were looking for some help with individuals from ESOP world who had M&A experience. And then just recently, we added an ex-CFO and to replace our CFO on the board. So today we have 3 external board members, myself, and then 3 internal board members. So I think that'll be it for a while until I resign my board position, probably in 2.5 years' time. But that was kind of the rationale and the reasoning why. And I think, again, it's part of that growing up as a company, to where you're not in Kansas anymore, and you're really responsible for something bigger than just the individual owner's perspective. You're responsible to run the company, to make good fiduciary decisions that's going to allow the company to grow and prosper, and protect that retirement plan for 100 or 200 people. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, great. And so I think I think having outside board members can add a lot of value, certainly understandable why a someone who starts a business or is in that entrepreneurial mode, right, wants to kind of be in charge of a lot of these things. But I think outside board members really can add a lot of value for the company going forward, especially as it starts to go forward, without you, right? You're going to have to find expertise and knowledge and all of those kind of things to take you forward. So
Yeah,
all great.
that's a good point, Chris, because one of the things that you look at, right, is not only, hey, I want to have an external board member so I could meet the requirement, but the question is what are the kind of people that I need on my board to allow the company to grow? And in our case, we were looking for M&A experience. It could be, what are the skill gaps that the management team has
Yeah.
that they're looking to fulfill on the board to be able to close that gap and to be able to move forward. It could be a marketing person, it could be an IT compliance person, it could be cybersecurity, and those needs could change over time. So it's not a question that you're on the board forever. It's you're on the board to serve a specific purpose. And as those needs change, the board makeup should change. And I think a lot of times people get, I don't want to say, they get complacent and they don't necessarily want to rock the boat. But the question is the people that are on the board at the founding of the ESOP or the co-op may not be the people that need to be there in 3, 5, or 10 years. And that's something that the board really needs to be able to think through and make sure that the board is really serving, its purpose in terms of company.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that business owners need to realize is you're going to want to, we're assuming you don't want to continue to work in this company until you're 80, or however, many days, any of us have on this earth, right? So a good way to help that, to help accomplish that is getting a good, strong board with maybe some outside people that can fill some roles and needs that you have.
Mhm.
One of the last things we'll talk about specifically about ESOPs is pass-through voting. One of the interesting things about this is actually corporate law. This is not necessarily ESOP law, so to speak. So these are kind of the issues, right, that require pass-through voting from a corporate governance standpoint. So pass-through voting is allowed, right, but not always required. There's certain areas in which it is required that you have pass-through voting to the shareholders, i.e. the ESOP, i.e. the trustee, right, or the ESOP participants, right? That's what we're talking about with pass-through voting. So in cases of merger or consolidation, you need to have a pass-through vote to participants. In areas of recapitalization or reclassification of the company, you need to have a pass-through vote on that. Liquidation or dissolution, you need to have a pass-through vote to participants on that. And sale of substantially all company assets, you need to have a pass-through vote on that. So again, in most cases, it's the trustee that's going to vote those shares in the ESOP, right? And it could be, as in Rick's case at the company that he started the ESOP at, it could be a directed trustee vote, right? But usually it's the trustee that votes, except for these issues. So one of the things you can notice here, that sale of substantially all company stock is not on that list, right? So if you have a stock sale instead of an asset sale, for example, that's kind of more of a settler function, as we mentioned earlier, rather than a trustee or fiduciary kind of thing. All right. So again, feel free to kind of jump in with some questions. So now we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit, go into the co-op model, and then at the end we're kind of we have some slides to kind of bring both models together, kind of talk about bigger governance kind of principles that both of these models kind of share. So let's kind of, again, talked about this at the beginning. Let's kind of demystify cooperative governance, okay? So cooperatives, again, are a type of corporation under law, right? Usually state law, right? And so they're going to have very kind of similar structure. They're going to have that board of directors. They're going to have the shareholder or member owners kind of section. They're going to have management more than likely. And of course, they're going to have employees, right? So that skeleton is still kind of the same, right? But again, who fills those roles within those companies can be a little bit different with a co-op. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit. So how do co-ops work? So co-ops are corporations, but they are different. So co-ops have some similarities to partnerships. They have some similarities to LLCs because they have members instead of shareholders, right? They have some interesting kind of wrinkles in how you can set up the day-to-day management of the company. But again, basically that structure is kind of the same. But one of the things that happens with co-ops is we use different words to describe very similar kind of structures, okay? So businesses are formed to benefit the patrons or the members or the member owners, right? And so there's a bunch of different types of cooperatives. We can have purchasing cooperatives, marketing cooperatives, credit cooperatives, insurance cooperatives, or employee cooperatives or worker cooperatives, right? So that's what we're going to kind of focus. So similar to maybe like a partnership might have it, right? If you are a partner of a, for example, a professional service firm like a law firm or an architectural firm, right? You're going to have a vote on major decisions, right? So you have one member, one vote. So each member, so for big corporate decisions, each member has one vote in terms of making decisions on those big decisions, on making decisions, right, within the company. One of the things that differentiates a co-op from a typical shareholder type model business is the share of surplus is based on use, in this case, in a worker cooperative, labor. So the more labor that you provide to the company, the larger share of the surplus you're going to have. So in a traditional kind of shareholder model, the more shares of stock that you have, the greater the financial return you're gonna have at the end of each year, right? So it's not based on, so that share of the surplus is not based on capital investment per se, right? If you make a capital investment in a cooperative, you are going to get paid out, right, for, you know, based on the terms of that capital investment, but not in terms of being like a shareholder that you might see in a typical shareholder type company. So again, one thing to remember is that not every employee will automatically be a member. So the way corporate cooperative law is set up is it's voluntary, right? So on both sides, so the employer can decide what kind of structure they want for to allow people to become members, and the employee themselves, right, will also decide whether or not they want to become a member. You know, that could be based on any number of things. So typically in most worker cooperatives that we see, you're going to have some employees that are members and some employees who are not members, right? So again, it's the members that have the kind of governance control over the cooperative corporation. Generally speaking, we always kind of advise against having the company make it too hard to become a member, right? You want to kind of try to encourage as many employees as you can to actually become members, so you get the full benefit of being a worker-owned or employee-owned business, right? But there could be some restrictions, so you could place restrictions based on the number of hours worked or some other type of thing like that kind of determines you know, there's going to be a membership fee. So each employee has to pay a membership fee to become a member owner of the cooperative. So depending on where you set that membership fee or how much you set that membership fee for can exclude people. But again, you want to try to do things that encourages people to take that leap from being just an employee to being an employee owner as well. All right. So cooperative law, again, is generally state law. Okay. And cooperative law is very interesting in that there's a lot of variation between various states in terms of their cooperative law. We won't get in the weeds, so to speak, on this too much, but a lot of cooperatives grew out of the agricultural sector and tend to be what we call producer co-ops, like entities like Land O'Lakes or Sunkist, for example, is a producer cooperative that's owned by the citrus farmers, right? So a lot of state co-op law is really tailored towards those kind of cooperatives, but in most cases, you can use the existing co-op law in each state to create the worker cooperative that you would like to create as well. But again, that variation can impact incorporation as well as governance. So for example, there are a few states that have a more advanced kind of worker cooperative statute, you can incorporate in one state and operate in another. For example, we helped a co-op in Florida, a company, selling owners sell their company to a worker cooperative in Florida. They're actually incorporated under the Ohio cooperative statute because of tax reasons and a couple of other reasons. So you can certainly do that. Co-op law, because it's kind of a specialized field, you'll definitely need to find an attorney familiar with the state statute, so you follow the specific governance as well as other kind of components of the cooperative law. So as we look at the three major corporate documents, so all corporations are going to have these basic three basic documents. But it's in worker cooperatives where that kind of variation, or the kind of well, I guess it is variation, right, in how each cooperative is set up, that cooperatives tend to make in a sense more use of their bylaws, specifically in kind of setting up the corporation to operate from a governance perspective in the way that they want. So again, each corporation is going to have articles of incorporation. Each state kind of determines the process and why and how you file those and where you file those articles of incorporation. You're going to have the bylaws. The bylaws kind of structure. I always call them the cooperative's constitution. It's the corporate constitution of the business, where it's going to put in place of kind of the strictures or the setup for becoming a member, the voting power that you have, how your board of directors is set up, and all of those kind of things. And then, of course, because it is a membership organization, it's going to have a membership agreement. So it's very similar to perhaps in a partnership. You're going to have a partnership agreement that you're going to have to sign, right? And so those three main documents are kind of the governance backbone, right, of each worker cooperative. So again, just like with any corporation that's formed, at the top is you're going to have kind of like the shareholders, or the members in the case of the member owners in the case of a worker cooperative. But for the main kind of governance or kind of overseeing the way the business operates, you're going to have a board of directors, right? And so the board of directors in a S corp or a C corp are going to have are going to be maybe a little bit different. So one of the things that's in most cooperative statutes is that the members vote for the board of directors. They again have, each member has one vote, and so the member owners, the worker owners in a cooperative, vote for the board of directors. In most states, all or a majority of board members must also be members of the cooperative. Okay, I think in I don't have a full census, but I think in most states, the requirement is that a majority of the board of directors consists of members of the worker cooperative. Okay, so one of the things, so I think there's a few states that require all of the board members to be members of the cooperative, but I think that's relatively rare. And so one of the things is it kind of it not just incentivizes, but it requires a larger share of employee representation on the board, right? But it still, in most states, gives you the opportunity that, as Rick and I were talking about a little bit earlier, to have some outside board members to add value to the board. All right. And so next up, again, one of the key things about a worker cooperative, and again, that kind of mirrors what you might find in a partnership, for example, is that you have one member, one vote. For the board of directors, major decisions decided at the annual member meeting, and again, with the variation that's allowed by the law, you can actually increase the number of things that one member, one vote can help decide within your company. But it's very flexible. There's a lot of difference between co-op to co-op. One of the things that we always say in the employee ownership world, it's not just in the worker co-op world, it's the ESOP world as well, is if you've seen one ESOP, if you've seen one worker cooperative, you've seen one worker cooperative, you've seen one ESOP, right? Because they can be, there's a lot of difference, right? And the law kind of allows that and makes it happen if that's the way you want to structure the business going forward, right? But again, you're going to have that at the top. You're going to have the shareholders or the member owners. You're going to have the board of directors. You're going to probably have some kind of management structure, and then you're going to have the employees. You're going to have that same basic skeleton from a governance standpoint. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we've got about another 10, 15 minutes, maybe 10 minutes worth of stuff. So I want to encourage folks, if you've got questions. I think I saw a few things come through the chat. Rick, I guess you'll let me know if any questions have come in so far. Let's see here.
I don't see anything yet in the chat, Chris.
Okay, all right, great, thanks. Excuse me. So we kind of laid out the basics, right? The basic structure of how governance works in an employee-owned company. So how do employee-owned companies handle governance in the real world, right? So what does this mean? All of these various kind of structures and rules. How does it actually function in the real world? So again, I think one of the things that we want to make clear today is that even though there are differences between the way a worker cooperative and a traditional kind of entrepreneurially run business might operate, or the same with an ESOP as well, on a day-to-day basis, these companies are going to actually run pretty much like any other company. Folks have to come in, do their job. Somebody needs to be in one or some group of people need to be in charge of kind of doing this, that, or the other thing. You're probably going to have someone that can, with a financial background that knows how to handle the financial aspects of the business. You're probably going to have team leaders, group leaders, section leaders. You're going to probably have some sort of CEO, general manager, or chief, or any number of kind of things. If you didn't know that these companies were employee owned and you took a walk through some of these companies, and they're probably going to look pretty much the same like any other business. And now one of the keys is, so I wanted to put this picture in here because we've all seen these kind of pictures where you got to go through and spot the differences, right? And so clearly those two pictures look pretty much the same, right? But you can see without too much effort that there are some differences. And so where we generally see the differences kind of play out, right, is in some of the following ways. So I hope everyone's kind of heard of vertically organized organizations and more horizontally organized organizations. So vertical, we tend to think of as top-down organizations where maybe there's not a lot of there's a lot of stuff coming from the top down, but there's not necessarily a lot of input or participation going from the top up. Okay. And so we tend to see these kind of more vertical kind of structures more often in the ESOP world, because again, there's no real requirement by law that you have, like, for example, the one member, one vote on major corporate decisions that you have with a worker cooperative, right? And then others are more horizontal. And again, the key point is that there's a ton of variation. So when we talk about the vertical versus the horizontally structured organization, we generally think of that in matters of who votes for the board, who serves on the board, how major decisions are made and how some minor decisions are made, how profits are shared, and who gets to share in those profits. These are all tend kind of be the areas in which we see the variation. So we have some ESOPs that we work with that have 100% employee owner boards, right? There's a company in Northeast Ohio here that any one of the participants in the ESOP can run to be on the board of directors of that business, right? and all of the employee owners get the vote who is on that board of directors. So they run it kind of like an election, right? We have some ESOPs that have a very kind of traditional kind of structure into who votes for the board and who serves on the board. And so there's a lot of variation there. And again, with that worker co-op model, there tends to be a broader kind of group of worker co-ops that bring more employees onto serving and voting for the board. Was there a question that was coming through?
No, Chris, I think it was just background noise.
Okay, great. So again, one of the other areas is how major decisions are made. So just like any other corporation, major decisions are going to go to the board of directors to decide these things, right? And so that's the same thing happens in employee-owned companies. Where the difference is when you get away from those major decisions and get into more minor decisions, I guess, if you want to call any decision that impacts the company is minor, right? But it's when we get into those, how broad do we want to spread out the decision-making authority? And so some companies, they spread that out a little bit broader. Some others, they encourage participation from the bottom up, so to speak. But there's still a specific sets or groups of people, whether they're strictly management leadership or the C-suite or whatever you want to say, executive leadership, that are where the major decisions are made. So it's really in how the minor decisions are made where we see the most variation. How profits are shared. So an ESOP is a retirement plan that has very strict rules on how profits are shared and how that happens on an annual basis. Co-ops have a little bit more flexibility in how they do that. Now, they do have to make some type of annual kind of distribution. Both types of employee ownership have to do that on an annual basis, right? But over and above that are, there are options that depending on who makes those decisions in the company, will kind of determine how additional profits are shared. And again, who shares in the profits. So each of the models that we've talked about will have different rules on how profits are shared and who gets the share in those. And then one of the broader kind of things that we see with employee-owned companies generally, and Rick, we talked about this when we were prepping for the session, is broader participation in decision making. Again, that can take a lot of different forms, but the research shows, and we as a organizationally believe that the broader that you can kind of share some participation in decision making, I think the stronger employee-owned company that you're going to have. Because if you want to get worker owners to think and act like owners, not just employees, right? What you want to try to do is move folks from just that employee mentality where they're just coming in, punching the clock, going home, and so be it, right? They're not necessarily concerned about other issues within the company. A good way to do that is to share in the decision making. If people feel that they have input into the way decisions are made, they're probably going to implement those decisions better and at a higher level, a higher rate than they would otherwise. So we really encourage folks to think about how they can broaden participation in decision making. And again, there's a huge level of variation from employee-owned company to employee-owned company and how they do that. But we really encourage companies to think about how and what that's going to look like within their company. Broader participation in profit sharing. So the research shows that if you provide a financial stake and a decision-making stake, or build that ownership culture piece within your in basic business metrics, a non-employee owned company, in terms of profitability, in terms of productivity, in terms of any number of business metrics, are going to generally on average be better when you combine that sharing in the profits with sharing in the decision making and getting buy-in, getting participation, and getting all of your employees or worker owners kind of moving in the same direction. one of the other things that we see quite a bit within employee-owned companies is collaborative approaches to organizing the workplace, right? So Rick mentioned it right at the outset. I think Deb mentioned it as well, is that you see companies that when they become employee-owned and when they kind of distribute both the profits or profit sharing as well as the decision-making, these companies just do amazing things. And one of the ways in which you can do that is to build collaboration so that your employees kind of get the buy-in, feel that they're a part of a large organization, and again, kind of moving in the same direction. And finally, I think to kind of close it out and kind of open up the floor for some questions, and again, Rick, feel free to jump in here because we talked about this quite a bit, is that another thing that these companies all tend to share are three major things, right? Committees. So we see a lot of committees for decision-making in a lot of different areas. So Rick mentioned the trustee committee, the administration committee. Employee-owned companies usually have a communication committee, and all different ways in which you can kind of broaden the participation in decision-making and the way things are done within your organization that can have a huge impact. We see most employee-owned companies take a different approach to managing the organization, and it's based on the stewardship model, right?
Yep. And
The idea is that we're just kind of stewards. To see it continue to go on beyond us and without us in some basic sense. And again, all of that leads into a long-term approach to growing the company and building shareholder value. So we hear a lot about how, especially in publicly traded companies, it's all quarterly results. We see that really successful employee-owned companies take a long-term approach to both growing the company and building the shareholder value. And Rick, if you want to add some thoughts there that you shared with me during the preparation.
yeah. So one of the key elements, right, is we talk about the fact that both in ESOPs and in co-ops, right, we share financial information. We try to make sure that people understand where we're going and what we're doing. But it's kind of a two-edged sword, right? I mean, if we're going to share financial information, and not necessarily a profit and loss statement, but it could be data in a graph, or it could be financial data and how we're doing month to month, year to year. Part of that key element, right, is that the employees have to understand, well, what does this really mean and how do I interpret it? And that's where, as Chris said, the communications committee at an ESOP really have, one of the responsibilities is to be able to help provide that education to the employees so that when we give them financial information, they can digest it and understand what it means. The second aspect of that is to be able to understand how is what I do on a daily basis, how does that connect the dots back to, shareholder value? If I don't understand, how my job relates back to that, it's going to be really difficult, for the employees to be able to make that difference and to be able to help out. Both in an ESOP and a co-op, the ability to reduce wealth inequality and to be able to add value and to be able, to put money in their pockets, whether it's, today money or it's retirement money, is really great. But if we're not going to take the time to educate our employees, to be responsive to their inputs, and to take a look at, how can they help us be able to determine how we can, be more effective in their delivery of services, in reducing waste, in adding value to the company, then we're kind of really missing out as managers of these organizations. And just think about it. If you had a privately held company where the CFO or the CEO makes all the decisions, doesn't ask anyone for any input, isn't really willing to talk to anyone about anything, kind of like the Nike way of management, just do it because I say, it's going to be really, really challenging for that company to operate as an ESOP and to be able to seek participative and involvement management philosophies. But just think how great that company could be if instead of one person, that's making all of the decisions with limited input, to where, every employee felt that they had a voice. Now, that doesn't mean that every employee gets to vote on everything by any means, because, that would be very challenging to do. But at the same point in time, every employee should feel that they have a voice and can add value to the organization. And that's really key. One of the things Chris talked about was, a stewardship approach. And this really gets back to, does the company have an agency governance perspective, which is, characterized by a very high power distance, by a controlled management philosophy, by an individualistic perspective, by a lack of organizational identification. Basically, there are controls put in place to make sure that, the agents are aligned with the principles. And those guys are only going to be there as long as it's of value to them. Think about an employee that's working and, hey, you know what, as long as I get my bonuses and my money and everything else, I don't want to deal with the company. I don't want to have to deal with any of the issues. I just want to get a paycheck and go home. That's not the kind of person that's going to help drive value in an employee-owned company. And a lot of times, as Chris said, we follow a stewardship perspective, which is, participative in involvement orientation. It's collectivism. It's a very low power distance, because if managers aren't willing to talk to their employees and employees don't feel empowered to talk to their managers, it's just not going to happen. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. In the research that I've done, I did 154 ESOP companies, and 96% of those companies self-identified as having a level of stewardship that was above the mean value, and it was statistically significant. So I think we had 6 companies out of 154 that self-identified as having an agency governance. So clearly, that's not how employee-owned companies operate, and I would assume that that's also not how cooperatives operate. And what was interesting was that companies that were more control-oriented when they became an ESOP, over time transitioned to a more participative involvement. And that could be because they went to the ESOP meetings or the ESOP association meetings or NCO meetings, because they rubbed elbows with other ESOPs, because this is what other ESOPs are doing. But I just found it very interesting that those companies that were participative before became more participative, and the companies that were collective, or not collective, but were more control oriented, eventually transitioned to be more participative. And I think that shows out that in my research that the companies that had a higher level of stewardship had a higher level of productivity per employee. And again, right, that's the bottom line, is we want to make this transition to employee ownership. We want to reduce wealth inequality, but at the same point in time, it's still a business. We still have to make money. And if we want to have an ongoing concern, we have to be able to pay the bills. And that's the exciting part, I think, from my perspective. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is you take a look at structurally and technically at both of the models, whether it's an ESOP or a worker co-op, they're kind of structured to if you let it, to encourage that stewardship mentality. I mean, if you take a look at an ESOP, it's a trust, and the whole idea of a trust is to put a valuable asset into this protective kind of case, right? To benefit people over multiple generations, right? And that's kind of the definition of stewardship. And the whole idea of a worker cooperative is very much, the same. It's creating this structure that allows this organization, this entity, to benefit people over the long term, over multiple generations, and so that kind of stewardship mentality is quite often what we see. And so to take an example of a ESOP company that we've worked with for a number of years, they've been an ESOP for over 40 years, and they're a manufacturing company, and they're one of the few manufacturing companies that I know that are not having any problem finding people to act as machine operators, welders, all of those kind of it's a machine shop, essentially machine manufacturing. And the reason is because they have this stewardship mentality. So they have second and third generation family members, for example, of employees that are kind of knocking at the doors, like, when are you guys hiring, kind of thing. And because they built this stewardship mentality, they've ingrained it in everything that the company does, and they've proven it over 40 years, which is multiple generations of workers, right, of employees, that they have this kind of approach, and people want to go work for them, and so I think there's a lot of benefits that you know, they're competing in a low margin, high volume kind of business, right? With overseas manufacturers who can do things quote unquote cheaper, right? But they've been able to compete in a lot of different ways. As Rick said, you still got to compete in the marketplace, right? But they've used this kind of stewardship idea as a way to do that, and to really build a lot of value for their people, but also build a lot of value in the company itself.
Yeah. I don't think that any ESOP or any co-op would voluntarily vote to transition all of their jobs to overseas.
Yep.
Right? I mean, it just doesn't work that way. So it truly is, again, if you're transitioning simply from private to ESOP or private to co-op, doesn't necessarily mean that the company is going to be successful. Part of that is, how do you change the culture to be able to engage the employees to make a difference? And if you can do that, then you are in a good place.
Yeah, and if you take a look at what workers or what people want from their jobs, if you take a look at all these surveys of just regular businesses, not just employee-owned businesses, right? But if you take a look at the things that they want from their job, employee ownership checks a lot of those marks automatically, but can also check the rest if you are deliberately, create this kind of stewardship approach to what you're doing. And so we're generally seeing, it's not the case in every situation. So we know that in the current environment, it's hard to find people, right? Good people, right people for jobs. Generally, somewhat anecdotally, I can tell you that for a lot of our ESOP companies, a lot of our worker cooperatives, they're not having the same level of difficulty because they've created a workplace that people want to work in, right? And they want to do good things for. So we're up against our time, Deb.
Yep.
Great.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your insights into governance and adds a lot of value. And if any of the participants have questions that didn't get reflected in the chat, please feel free to send them to Deb or myself, and we'll get them with Chris and get you guys a response. Thanks, Chris.
Yep. Thank you.